Sorry, we're running a little late. We had some technical difficulties. I'm Ali Khudur. I'm going to be moderating this session. And first up, we have a lecture by Francisco Gonzalez de Canales. He's going to be our second keynote speaker for our conference this year. Francisco Gonzalez de Canales is a professor of architectural history, theory, composition, and a unit master at the Architectural Association since 2008. Gonzalez de Canales studied architecture at ETSA Seville, ETSA Barcelona, and Harvard University, and worked for Foster & Partners and Rafael Moneo before establishing CANALES and Lombardero, an award-winning office based in London and Seville. From 2002 to 2007, he got the FPI and the La Caixa scholarships, which helped him to develop his own research interests at the University of Seville, UNAM Católica de Chile, and Harvard University, where he received the Dimitris Piccionis Award in 2007. He has been a teaching fellow at Harvard University and the Boston Architectural College, visiting professor at the Instituto Tecnológico de Monterrey and City University of London. He has published more than 30 articles in academic journals in his field, and among his recent books are First Works, Experiments with Life Itself, Rafael Moneo, A Theory Through Practicing, Rafael Moneo, Building, Writing, and Teaching, and Politics and Digital Fabrication. So please give a warm welcome to Francisco. Thank you.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. I'm very happy to be here presenting part of my research and work from the office, if I have the time to present it, because it comes a little bit at the end of this short lecture. The name of it is somehow reflecting on some of the issues that the conference was proposing, and I think that it might sound a bit scary to use cultural conflict, you know, and it is not. In my view, I think that cultural conflict is also related to our way in which we are able to allow plurality in our society. It's a way in which we are able to administrate dissent, not only in terms of verbalization of dissent, but also in terms of how we want to live in our cities. So I want to develop this through certain theories, especially coming from Latin American critical studies, and also using some historical references to illustrate it. I think that everyone is more or less familiar with, I don't know if this is only a pointer, no? So like this, okay. With a canonical test by Ren Koolhaas when he was describing the generic city. It was a description in which it was very difficult to, through the pictures as well, not to really see anything. It's this notion of homogeneity that is mostly based on the idea of not being able to distinguish one thing from another. And we have to understand that this approach taken by Ren Koolhaas, in a way, was also the result of confrontation towards the intellectual status quo of his time, especially the work developed by anthropologists like Marc Rogier, also even the conference, the Any Conference Anywhere, where most of the architects of his time in 1992 were positioning towards new responsibility towards the context, towards the city, towards all these things that, for instance, were developed by Rafael Moneo in the Murmur of the Side. So his position was polemical and, in a way, confronting this kind of status quo and saying that probably this homogenization that we were witnessing today could be understood also as a movement of global liberalization that says something that down with character. So for a certain time, this was an idea that was appealing to architects, but the reality is that when we were approaching the reality of the city itself, we couldn't find this process of homogenization. Maybe if you look at it superficially and this kind of big statistics and so on, you can find that this thing, this thing, this thing, this other these are almost the same, and this is how many parts of the, let's say, developing world, that I don't like to use that expression, but it's how these people putting data together, they normally say things like that. This is what you find everywhere. The cities are developing with these kind of schemes. It doesn't matter if the first thing that you saw was Panama, the second is Mumbai, the third is Shenzhen, this is Shanghai, this is Santiago in Chile, this is Seville, this is one of the cities where I live. It doesn't matter, it's repeating the same kind of urban development here, there, everywhere in the world. But the reality is that this is only when we look at it from the distance, when we don't look at it from data, and we don't look at the real practices that are occurring in these cities. Because if you look at London, that is developing its own skyline in recent years, you can have this image and say, okay, they're producing these icons, it's what is happening everywhere else in the world. But you go down to 2 streets, 4 streets, kind of back from this skyline, and you find something like that. So you see over there, the Gherkin is a bit blurred. You see it? So, and this is what is happening in the street. I don't know if this is an image of homogeneity. It's a very weird one. It doesn't represent homogeneity at all. What is happening is that the non-homogeneous practices of the people in the cities is what's creating a kind of cultural character that is not a cultural character that can be defined as univocous, it cannot be defined as unitarian, it cannot be defined as cohesive, but is all these kind of, I would say, conflicting different ways of living the city, walking the city, dressing in the city, eating in the city, different ways of positioning yourself towards the city in the end. Happens everywhere, like you go to Hong Kong, typical sky, and then you go during a Sunday, as you see these very particular strange gatherings of Filipino people in the, let's say, the ground floor of Foster's Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank. And you go to Miami, okay, this is the very generic suburban development that is happening all across the world and specifically in the US. You zoom in, because this is the Google that say, okay, all the people is living with the American dream and so on, and you start to see things like that, no? There is a typical coffee shop that is attached to a house, and they have this very specific from Miami walk-through coffee window. That is a place where the people come, they park their cars, they come to the window, they have the coffee at the window with other people, and they take their car and go back. That is very different from the typical American taking your 7-Eleven cup of coffee, you know, getting into the car, because these people understood that the most valuable thing about having coffee is the conversation that you have having coffee and not having the coffee itself. That is meaningless, no? So in a way, all these kind of things are very particular to a context, to a way of inhabiting that is conflicting to others, no? Like you see one thing with another, they're very different to each other, and they don't represent this homogeneity that everyone says that is happening across the world. So I would say that probably, and this is another picture of Whitechapel, again, with all these kind of different people living together, I would say that what is happening in a way is that the cultural kind of practice is not anymore confined by a certain territory, it's not only confined by a certain region, by a certain city. It's in a way going to the scale of the practice of the people, of the individual, of a group of individuals. So there is a kind of reconnection of how culture is unfolding in the city that is not depending so much on a kind of integral cohesiveness of the culture itself, but on all these different cultures that are happening at the same time. So across the 90s and the beginning of the 21st century, there were different theories to define this idea of how the culture is, in a way, lived in the cities. I normally refer to these basic notions. One normally understood of multi-communitarism that is happening in many places. So the culture is allocated in different ethnic or cultural enclaves that is probably happening here, and I think that I witnessed this kind of organization. Normally, all theories, they say that it's, I wouldn't say dangerous, but it's not a very stable way of organizing the city because it's generating a lot of, let's say, discomfort between the different communities. There is a lot of lack of confidence. You say, oh, what is happening in this place? So normally this has been rejected in the way in which we plan the city and say, okay, we should avoid these kind of multi-communities. And there is the other thing that normally is named multiculturalism. That is the one that actually reactionary politicians in Europe, they're saying that it is a failure and it's not working anymore. But in reality, if we look at it in the way that is happening in many cities, even in some places in London, this multiculturalism is not so much just a free mix of cultures, but there is always a kind of hierarchy between the way in which the cultures are mixed. And I think that in many cases, what is happening is that there is a superficial assimilation of external cultural features from a central and dominant culture, the way in which we like to go to eat Japanese food or poke or whatever, but it's from our perspective or from our way of living, but we take a little bit of it, we're dressing cowboy boots because it's fashion, I don't know, all these kind of things that we do that actually are not talking about a mix of cultures, but it's an appropriation from a central and dominant culture that is different from what I'm trying to propose today. That is much more related to a critical tradition that is born in Latin America and that is named transculturation. Transculturation is something that was, it's a term that was coined by Fernando Ortiz, that is a Cuban anthropologist in the 40s, in the beginning of the 40s actually, is independent from other post-colonial critical approaches that started also in the 40s, 50s with Frantz Fanon, etc. And it's talking about these cultural relationships in a different way. Fernando Ortiz defines transculturation as a set of ongoing transmutation that never ceases. It is always a process in which the two parts of the equation end up being modified. From this process springs out a new reality, which is not a patchwork of features, but a new phenomenon, original and independent. And I think that one of the very important definitions of this term is not being a patchwork of features, no? And very much against one cultural theory, what was very prevalent, especially in the US, but at that time, that was the theory of the melting pot. No? And I'm considering that we are creating new nation states by putting together different cultural features from different kind of origins. No? And we meld them into a pot and we create this new kind of culture for the nation state. No, I think that this kind of arrangement is trying to, or this theoretical proposition is trying to avoid this idea of the melting pot. It's avoiding it by saying that it's a dynamic process of confrontation, by saying that it's a cultural organization which prevents the possibility of any stable function or synthesis. I will come later to these definitions, but I wanted also to say that the theoretical approach began with the book of Contrapunteo Cubano del Tabaco y el Azúcar that we are seeing here. It was something that was followed by other Latin American important intellectuals, like, for instance, José María Arguedas, that was a writer and anthropologist, is one of the most, I think, important representatives of the writers in Latin America that became very relevant in the 60s and 70s, like Gabriel García Márquez, or Juan Rulfo, or Mario Vargas Llosa, and Arguedas, that was also Peruvian, and who was living all his childhood surrounded by indigenous people, that he reflected on that experience in Los Ríos Profundos. This book, there is an English version of it. I don't know if I guess there is also a French. I'm not sure about an Arabic version of this book, but it's telling about this way in which your experience with these indigenous people when he was not able to speak Quechua himself was a kind of attempt to translate an experience that didn't have a language yet. And I think that this kind of process of mutual understanding and mutual kind of approach to cultural behavior is a leading force in the writings and in the thinking of Jose Maria Arguedas that also was, in a way, condensed in this book, Formación de una Cultura Nacional Indoamericana, where he's positing his approach to transculturation from his own perspective, a perspective that was also taken by Angel Rama, that is probably the most important critical theorist, and his book Transculturation, or Transculturación Narrativa in America Latina, was actually dealing with the authors that I was mentioning before, García Márquez, Rulfo, describing how this Macondo that García Márquez used to use as an imaginary territory, or Colima, that is the imaginary territory of Juan Rulfo, was always a reality that didn't have a language yet. And the different approaches to this kind of description of this complex reality. And the good thing about Angel Rama is that he also made a translation of that to the way in which people inhabit the city in a book that is La Ciudad Letrada, the letter city that you see on the right. And is something that some urban planners and architects have been studying in order to understand how this notion of transculturation could be understood also in the city and from the way in which people themselves are inhabiting the city. As I was saying before, the notion of transculturation started independently from other post-colonial critical positions, are probably better known across the world, those relating to French colonialism or those related to British colonialism, such as Homi Bhabha. And in many cases, there's been an attempt to compare transculturation with notions like hybridity, that you see here. That is one of the main concepts used by Bhabha. Bhabha saying that hybridity is a problematic of colonial representation and individuation that reserves the effects of colonialist disavowal so that the other denied knowledges enter upon the dominant discourse and estrange the basis of its authority, its rule of recognition. This kind of discourse that I think is very ingenious in some ways and very relevant, and it develops ideas that have been widely spread in post-colonial thinking, like that the assimilation of metropolitan works, let's say Western works, tradition, and genders in colonial context, and that hybridizing them, and by doing that, they undermine the authority and coherence of the colonizing processes with greater effectiveness than open resistance. This is one of the recipes of Bhabha. All the dissolution becomes a twofold process by which the colonizer not only discursively conceives the colonized, but somehow the colonized in turn also conceives the colonizer. So this kind, I think, very intriguing and very relevant thinking on post-colonial kind of theory and critical thinking that somehow didn't arrive to a good port in many cases in architecture, because hybridity was something that in many cases was derived as something else, and it's something that is not only part of our time, it's historically happened since the beginning of the idea of creating nation states, and how they should be supported by a very cohesive and strong cultural identity. I remember, for instance, in like a familiar example for me, that is the 1929 exhibition in Seville, where there was a representation of all Latin American countries. They were, in a way, they were asked to produce pavilions with a national architecture. No? So I remember, for instance, the one in Mexico was very explicit. You have to produce, in the competition for the pavilion, you have to produce a national architecture. No one knew what was that. No? National architecture, what is that? Guatemala, national architecture, actually built by a guy from Granada in Spain, national architecture as well. And the question is that this guy, Manuel Amabilis, that he was not only an architect but also an archaeologist, he tried to do that by putting together pieces that he has found in his archaeological excavations. Like, let's say, he was referencing Palenque, he was referencing Uxmal, he was referencing especially Mayan architecture, and he had a book in what he was able to explain, this is coming from this building, this is coming from this building, this is coming from this building. So this is a hybrid architecture, putting pieces from different precedents of historical architecture that for some people was a hybrid that was able to be post-colonial because also was claiming, let's say, the legacy of the indigenous people. But the reality is that this is not hybridity in the terms that we were discussing before. This is not transculturation as a process. This is historical eclecticism. This is something else. And I don't think that this is really representing a kind of national, kind of cultural. It is a kind of frustrated attempt to produce such a reflection of how should be the culture of modern Mexico or of modern Guatemala. And the second thing, I think that we have to be very careful about how we understand, and this is a contemporary example. I've been traveling around the world for some time. I always enjoy to see which is the version of McDonald's for each kind of region, context, the Macarabia. There is a Spanish kind of Maquivérica with Spanish. It has a bit of Spanish ham, but also just a pork fillet inside. When Baba is saying that hybridity by, in a way, adapting the metropolitan discourse to the local context is confronting it, I'm not so sure that it is so much undermining the power or the hegemony of that colonial force. To the contrary, and this is something that has been further theorized in Latin America, hybridity has been, in many cases, the logic of colonization, the way in which the colonizer goes deeper into the soul of the people. So it is not the way of responding to that. It's the way in which the colonizer and the colonial mind is able to go deeper and deeper. So the power of McDonald's or whatever is going deeper because it's taking also features from the local culture in the same way that, I don't know, the Bible was translated to Quechua in order to get deeper into the indigenous populations, or the way in which, for instance, it is a very famous passage of The Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad, the guy who was getting more ivory than anyone else in Congo, was doing that because he was using not only industrial means of exploitation, but he was using religious means of exploitation, so getting deeper into the religious beliefs of the local people in order to exploit them further. So hybridization of means, like industry plus beliefs, industry plus sensitivity, is always a very strong, very, very strong tool that the colonizer and colonization have been using for many years. I wouldn't undermine this, and I wouldn't say that by hybridizing things or by having hybridized burgers, we are really undermining the power of this reality. Having said this, I think that by bringing back transculturation, I'm trying to avoid this first eclectic historicism that is so present when we try to represent culture. And I also trying to avoid like fixed representations of a certain local or regional culture. And saying that basically I'm, in a way, priming cultural performance or practice as something more fluid, something more related to dynamism, time, changing, than a strict cultural representation that is more based on symbolically linked, let's say, cultural features, and a priming cultural process over a defined and delimited cultural object. And I think that, to put an example, I'm saying that it is not so much about how the hamburger looks like more Arabian or more Spanish. It is what we do with it. It's not about the fact of the hamburger, but it's how we eat the hamburger, how we are sitting or on the floor or in a park. So all the practices around, revolving around these objects are more important for these cultural exchanges and for the representation of these exchanges than the particular object like the hamburger or the building itself. And this is what I'm trying to develop with this theory. So, okay, so I don't know if it's more or less clear, the principle. If you have any questions so far, or we continue, because what I want to do now is how we translate this to architecture, what we can do as architects, okay? Because in many cases we talk about very, very big things, you know, global capitalism, or the market, the social condition, the ethos, but then we don't know what to do as designers. And I want to go down to the practice of architecture, what we can do as architects, and I'm going to be a bit propositional in that sense. And first of all, I'm going to show two, let's say, opposing strategies. Both are coming from Latin American traditions or architectural references. The first is related to probably the most successful avant-garde in Latin America, one that was further exported to other regions. So it started in Mexico, muralism, this painting of murals by Rivera, Orozco, Siqueiros, but also it started to invade Ecuador, Guatemala, Colombia. So it was probably the most successful and the most recognizable artistic expression in Latin America in modern times. Diego Rivera himself, being a cubist painter before becoming a muralism, he said that he wanted to reverse what he was doing as a cubist painter. He was saying that when I was a cubist painter, I was trying to put into one canvas all the different faces, all the different views of one single object. What I'm trying to do now is putting all the multiple realities of Mexico, that is what he's trying to describe here, in one single view. So it's in a way for him reversing that process and using public buildings, and this is very important because this is the National Palace in Mexico with this very important painting of the history of Mexico. So the building is going to be supporting this, and the building is going to be communicating this cultural plurality that is happening in Mexico. And actually, there was an architect very well known in Mexico. He was a very close friend of Diego Rivera and Frida Kahlo, that is Juan O'Gorman, and he developed this building that could be, let's say, an advanced kind of development of the previous concept, where the painting is integrated as a mosaic of stones. So you see here, and also he's developing a very kind of canonical international style building. No? This is the Library of UNAM. UNAM is a very straightforward modernist building that is clad with this mosaic that is representing the history of knowledge in Mexico, incorporating knowledge from indigenous people, knowledge from, let's say, colonial times, knowledge in modern Mexico and abroad. It was a building that was highly celebrated, for instance, by Hitchcock, the architectural historian, in the international style 50 years after, when he was putting these buildings as an example of how modernism was able to adapt itself to other territories, no? Like for instance, Mexico. But the reality is that only a couple of years after O'Gorman finalized this work, he was publicly rejecting it. And it was very curious because he was saying, okay, first it looks like an American guy wearing an indigenous Mexican dress, so it doesn't make any sense. It's like when you go to Tijuana and you get your poncho, no? And you say, okay, I'm Mexican now. And so it's this kind of, so he was saying something of that kind. And in a way, he was saying, okay, I'm trying to represent the plurality of culture in Mexico, but I noticed that I was mainly, when working with indigenous population, referencing Mexica people, not the one that were dominating the Mexico Valley. But I was leaving behind the Olmecas, and I was leaving behind the Mayans, and I was leaving behind the people who came from Ireland, because he was originally from Ireland. I was leaving behind this and this and this and that, and he noticed that it was a frustrating attempt to try to represent culture in this way, or the plurality of culture. You can add more and more and more, and now we put the Jews, we put the, it doesn't matter. You're always going to leave someone aside. And the more people you include, the more clear it's going to be that you are leaving something or you are leaving someone outside of it. No, so this frustration, it is what is leading me to another alternative way to approach cultural plurality in modern societies, and probably how we can work with this in contemporary cities. And I'm going to go to the work of Lina Bobardi. Bobardi, being herself an expat, going to Brazil, coming from Italy, very well related to local population, knowing very well the local context, maybe you know a bit about that. And Brazil itself being one of the most diverse, ethnically and culturally and racially countries in Latin America. And I think that the fact that some of the examples that I'm using are coming from Brazil is not arbitrary, but probably this kind of diversity made this architecture possible. And Lina herself, I think that he was representing this in her house, Casa de Vidrio, that is shown here, and how, in a certain way, he never tried to represent culture through, let's say, the implementation of a certain facade, what is relying again on the symbolic value of whatever we can read in the language of architecture. The language of architecture is almost devoid of any meaning, and architecture, what it's doing is acting as a support for the cultural practice to unfold and to be able to negotiate different positions by themselves. So you see how the original modernist kind of house, start to be populated in different ways, adding this kind of different layouts. I would like to see that each of these things, because furniture in many cases is able to trace how life is. No? So you see how you go to a sofa and you see almost the empty, kind of the void of the person who was sitting before. No? You feel that there is a kind of the trace of inhabitation. So all these things are representing different ways of inhabiting. Some of them more colonial, some of them more indigenous, some of them probably more modern, but they're changing through time. They are negotiating themselves through time. They are a practice, they are a fluid, they are dynamic, they are a process. So I think that this kind of changing of the way in which you inhabit the house, it is more relevant to discuss what is transculturation in architecture than trying to do this symbolic facade, trying to incorporate all the different ways in which culture could be represented. I think that what is happening here is that, again, the cultural practice, the way in which we inhabit, is the thing that is really representing what is culture today. And I think that this has also a translation to the city, and how this idea of different ways of inhabiting, different ways of positioning yourself towards the city can have a manifestation in buildings such as the MASP in Sao Paulo, a building that is interesting because first it's in a very kind of rough, it's a very tough avenue. I don't know if you know Avenida Paulista, that is coming here. It's a not very welcoming place. And then suddenly she decided to push the program in two different ways. That is going up and going down and liberating this space that is a space that is going to be appropriated by the people. And I like this drawing because in a way I think that it's really addressing what I'm trying to say. Architecture itself doesn't rely on language in order to express culture, but it's all this that is happening, framed, articulated by architecture, where you have this kind of seemingly carnivalesque experience of people performing very weird things. You know, as you say, this is the way in which Lina Bobardi was thinking about a future appropriation of this space. There are sculptures, there are playgrounds, there are people doing I don't know what. And architecture is only articulating this, articulating a relationship with the city, a city that, as I'm saying, is not an easy one, is full of conflict. So the scale of this space is going to be relevant, the way that you are aligning yourself and liberating that back, the way in which you are programming. So you are going to guarantee there is going to be presence of people happening here. So all these very minimal kind of architectural decisions are the ones that are going to be relevant to generate a space where people are presenting themselves. They are not represented by the architecture, but they are presenting themselves as different positions towards the city while, you know, performing their everyday life or most desired activities. So this picture of, I mean, it's a weird space somehow, but you see sort of sleeping after hangover, someone, I don't know, reading poetry. This guy is probably just, okay, it's raining, I have to be here, the police. There is someone selling stuff. I think that it manifests this idea that probably what we have to do as architects is to engage with the possibility of generating spaces in which this plurality might happen. There are means by which we can contribute to this kind of architecture. It's about a certain mastery of form in terms of how you articulate in the relationship to the city itself, that, as I'm saying, is not a neutral territory, or you are also negotiating the different degrees of intimacy of the space that is very different, this one from the one that is happening behind, no, open to the Belvedere. No? So there are also an articulation of different conditions, no? Different ambience here, 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 that the building is able to produce, and is able in that way to, in a way, articulate the different relationships to the city and to the ways in which the people inhabit the city by themselves. I think that this architecture is not isolated in the case of Maspi. You can find references in Vilanova Artigas. It's a building that I always like because it doesn't have any door. It's, again, a very simple gesture of articulating spaces and in a way guaranteeing that there are going to be different conditions for people to relate to the building and to relate to themselves. That is what happens here. So it's just by manipulating the slabs, manipulating the scale, manipulating these very minimum resources of architecture that we are producing a space that is mainly based in this idea that the building is not representing the people are able to represent themselves through the way in which they inhabit the space. And the simultaneous presence of these people in this space is making this, or is producing this idea of cultural plurality that I was talking about from the beginning. It also affected other places like Cuba. I think that it's not by chance that Cuba is a place where there is also a tremendous mix of different cultures and ethnic backgrounds, and probably also a place where you can find another architecture that is not relying on any kind of figurative gesture or any symbolic kind of gesture to represent culture, but it's only this very strict articulation of different conditions through architectural form and the relationship to each other that becomes relevant. I don't know if I have the time to talk a bit more or not. Sometime I'm going to be very quickly. But I wouldn't like to be compared with these architects. I don't think I'm close, or our office is close to the, I think, excellence that the architecture of Vilanova Artigas or Lina Bobardi achieved. But in some ways, we were inspired with this, or by this idea of a formal articulation, and how architecture is above all the mastery of this scale in which you want relations to happen. And form is one of the means by which you are defining that. Form that could be like a superimposition of different typologies that is happening in this house, that is basically working with walls, and the wall might be very straightforward, saying, okay, this is public, this is private, in order for the private to, let's say, grow and to unfold, we need to make this very straight separation, and then the life is going to unfold behind. So form is dividing these conditions in a very explicit way, or sometimes it's not the wall, it is the floor and the roof, while you want to say, okay, there is a continuity of the common ground, but at the same time there is articulation of it, so you can have different conditions on a high rise that is happening through how the disposition of the balcony is able to generate an alternative correlation or interrelation between people that is normally not happening in the high rise. So, so we've been interested in form as a way of articulating human relations and different ways of inhabiting both the city and architecture itself. And I would like to talk about 3 projects that develop this idea in 3 different ways. One is a house in Spain. I think that this goes back to how domesticity needs to be rethought today. And it's a very peculiar project because the client is a guy of 75 years. So he's in a way old. He knows that he's not going to be here for very long. So he thinks that his house is going to be thought for the people who is going to come later, which is something difficult. No? How are you going to produce something that is not for me, that is for someone? I'm God, I'm able to see the future. No, I don't know. So, but this is part of the role of the architect, to be able to produce an architecture that is not only for the people who are now today, but it's also for the people that is going to come later. The context is this kind of suburbia in Seville. And what we propose is, again, say architectural form is relevant in terms of defining, let's say, areas, conditions for living, some more intimate, some more kind of interrelated to infrastructure, some of them more public. But then we will like to have a certain flexibility within these different kind of bands that we are creating. So this is a superimposition of all the different layouts that we were thinking about for this house, not only in the present, but also in the future. These are some of the things we were thinking. So the guy is living by himself, so it's the dream house. I'm happy, I'm living alone. Then the daughter got a divorce. He's coming with his kids to live with him, so we need to rearrange the house. Then there is the kids of the kids coming also, and more people coming together, 2 families living together, anarchy, we don't know what is going on. So we were testing all this with this idea that we keep a structure that is in a way organizing the house, but at the same time we are keeping that flexibility that is not saying or prescribing how you have to live the house. So architecture, what it's doing is articulating these different possibilities of inhabitation, these different sensitivities towards how you want to live in your own home. The walls were something that we want to keep as solid, to really define certain boundaries between the conditions. So it's a brick wall that is a structural wall at the same time, as you see here. But we wanted to create this kind of connection, this connection that I think was important. Each of the bands is going to be independent. You see one here, another one here, another one here, but each of them are going to be somehow connected in a way that with this kind of enfilade that is a bit diagonal, you're able to foresee a bit of what is happening in the next space, but you are not totally disclosing it. So there is a certain tension between, okay, I know there is a connection between the different ways in which I'm appropriating the space, but there is an intimacy and there is a kind of disconnection that allows me to feel free to adopt the form of living that I prefer. So there is always a form used not in a very straightforward way, but always getting this tension that I think is more rich and is more interesting for architecture. These are all the views. This is Nuria, my partner, because CANALES Bombardero is with Nuria, who is sitting here today. And these are all the aspects of the house that I don't have the time to talk about. And I have two other projects very briefly. The second one, the first one is related to how form is able to articulate different forms of inhabitation. In this case, what I'm talking about is the idea of form as able to articulate the relationship to a certain context. And in this case, the context is in the middle of the mountains. That is a context that is, I think, not close to the one here. The mountains are very different, but it talks about this idea of territory and what do you do with an architecture in the territory. In this case, it's a very, very, very small public building. It's a medical center that is in a very strange location. It's probably this location in between this sports court, a road, trees. There are centenary trees. The trees that are lasting longer than architecture, which is interesting as well. Normally we think about vegetation as something ephemeral, but here vegetation is lasting more. And how in this kind of environment and this kind of very idyllic for pigs, as you see here, this is the place in which is produced the best ham, the Spanish ham in Spain. And these pigs are eating the fruits of these almond trees that you are seeing over here. So the form is used here in order to establish a certain relationship to this condition, a condition that includes, as I'm saying, these different accidents to a point. And the program is sorted out in a very straightforward way. These are the two medical offices, and these are the toilets, and this is an office. And as you see, for instance, the tree, the relationship with the existing vegetation that I'm saying, probably the building is going to be turned down and the vegetation is going to stay. And the vegetation is a way in which the architecture is constructed. So the tree is used as a shading system for the windows. The windows are high, so I think that form implies also the location of a window in the sense that this window is nice for the office because the guys are here. They are not seen, so you don't want to be seen in a medical center how you are treated, no? And you are not feeling well. So, I have a pain here, and everyone is looking at you. I see you. No, it's a different kind of relationship, and then you're able to see the tree, the mountains, and so on. So the relationship with the tree, I think, is negotiated through form. You see, this is how it becomes a screen. It's becoming also like the place where the pigs come. Actually, the building is full of stains from the pigs. I like that because they contributed to the image of the building. It is also the way of signaling the entrance. While the part in which you are related to the court, everything is this kind of, this is also people contributing to the production of this space because all the kids playing with the balls, they are producing a very nice polka dot facade over here. But you see that, in a way, this is very kind of blind wall that is very different from the one of the tree, that is very different from the one of the road, that it was meaningless to say, okay, I'm going to put a kind of sidewalk here, so it is continuing like the road in order to get into the office. And each of these formal decisions are related to the way in which the building is going to be interrogating the context and articulating it. As you see over here, and I think that when I saw this picture for the first time, I was very happy because in a way the building is a bit older now, but the people is appropriating it, putting very kind of kitsch benches, the signaling of the regional kind of government and all that. And I think that it's fine. I mean, it's fine, it works, because in a way, the formal attitude, it is what is relevant, and all these things, they could be, they couldn't be, it doesn't matter. They are not really the things that are relevant in the way of producing architecture here. The things that are relevant are this kind of formal articulation, and it is expected for the people to appropriate, to see it, to come, for the pigs to stay in all this, to the kids to stay in all the other part. And I think that the confidence in form allows you to have all these kind of small appropriations of people without being very scared. No? Normally you go to any kind of architectural magazine, everything is extremely designed, you cannot live. And I remember Picasso used to say that he likes to live in houses where he can spit on the floor. Maybe going too far, but in a way, you cannot live in a place that's over-designed. You need to have this kind of idea that it is the people who is constructing the domestic space, it's not the architect. And I think that you need to leave that room for the people to complete the work in certain way. And then this is the latest, one of the latest things we are working on is a large project in San Salvador, in El Salvador. It's our first large also Latin American building. It's a competition that we won a couple of years ago. And it's in the center, real center of San Salvador. Here you have the National Palace. That is a gigantic neoclassical building. Here you have the Metropolitan Cathedral, also gigantic building. And this is the square that is in front of the Metropolitan Cathedral. As you see, very lively area, full of people, full of informal appropriation, full of people practicing the city in many different ways. Informality is very relevant in Latin America. Every time you have a canopy, you will have people below. It's inevitable. And I like that this is happening. No, it's a very, very simple formal gesture. It's able to generate a life in the city. No? So we were looking at these kind of ideas, no? How with minimal means you were able to make the people inhabit, contribute to the city, and contribute to how the civic role of architecture could be seen through the very use of the people of it. So this is the building that we were providing. It's also a building that is commemorating the 200 years of the independence of San Salvador. So there was a pavilion that is from the 19th century that is going to be rebuilt. That is at the entrance of the building. There is another, I don't know, 200 years old tree here. So again, trees lasting more than buildings in some cases. And this is what we are proposing, that in a way is bringing to the right scale, that is the scale of these gigantic buildings, the scale of the pavilion, that by itself it was like a miniature, and we needed to, in a way, do the transition between the small scale of the pavilion and the larger scale of this part of the city. This is the pavilion that actually we had to redo after the competition with all the detail. This is another example of historical eclecticism that we were mentioning before, that doesn't represent San Salvador at all, and actually was built by a French architect. And he was saying that it was using Mayan references in the tiles. Actually, they are Mexica. They are not, so total disaster, but doesn't matter. We have to rebuild it because it's part of the commission that you see here. And then this is how we are articulating it through the superimposition of three different typologies that have to do to three ways of being in the city. One of the spaces that work are those in which you stay. And you don't stay because you are consuming, but you stay because you are fine. And I think that we need to really create spaces that are public and you stay in there. Normally, the public space is where you are, the place where you are circulating. No? And it's a shame. So for that purpose, around the beauty of the pavilion, we decided to have a space where people could stay with water. It's a hot climate, so people enjoy being around the water, being looking each other with a bit of a stepping, with a covering, very important. The covering is always going to allow life to happen. As I said, if you go to most of Latin American cities, every time, even if it's a super nasty highway, people is going to be down doing stuff. Then there is another typology that is a typology related to congregation that is generated through this kind of cloister that you see here. It's a cloister that is also thought for people to appropriate in a certain way, but that is also dividing or articulating two different conditions with the use of architectural form. And I like this solution, this of the cloister made with walls and not columns, because it's properly dividing these two conditions. One that is here, that is dark, that is in a way silent, that is a typical one that you have in a cloister. You walk around and you feel a certain intimacy, and this other one that is the courtyard itself, that is more lively, that is full of light, that is this other experience, and that going from here to here can be rearranged in different ways. You see here, it's a more modern mechanical architecture that you see that it could be converted into an exhibition hall or also auditorium or whatever you need. You see here the scale of the building, how it's matching with or scaling up the pavilion that we were mentioning before. This is the pavilion, the building acting as a background for it with people around. You see, this is the cloister and how the walls are defining these two spaces, so you have to walk all the depth of the wall in order to go to the other kind of condition. These are different kind of arrangements of the space. Some of them you also consider unfolding this building inside to the courtyard, so generating these big spaces, space for performances. And so I don't want to be in a way exemplary of anything. I'm trying to, in a way, respond to the question of how we can, as architects, have a role in the construction of a city that probably not necessarily more democratic, but it is trying to offer a experience of democracy by saying that while allowing all this plurality to happen by the practice of the people, then you're able to showcase that plurality to others. You're able to, in a way, be aware of that plurality, so you are making culturally more sustainable urban environments. And I think that this is everything that I wanted to say. Thank you for your time. I have to, okay.
Thank you so much, Francisco, for your wonderful presentation. We're going to open the floor for questions from the audience for 10 minutes. If anybody would like to share something or has a question to ask.
Hi. You spoke about, in the beginning, about moving from multi-communitarism to multiculturalism. And you explained through your presentation about this transculturation thing. I'm speaking about Beirut, which is a capital that is into multi-communitarism more than multiculturalism, where architects are playing the role of enhancing this closure and private places, where you can live in a building where you have your own pool, your own sport thing, your own thing. You don't go out of your building because everything is available in your building. So this way of seeing things, it's opposing or avoiding this melting pot that you are proposing through architecture, through public spaces. We don't really have lots of public spaces. My question is, how would you, as someone expert, um, advise if those architects came to you and said, what would be our guidelines to start building somewhere, knowing that our cultural also spaces are also private, they're in universities. Universities have their own museums, apart from a national museum and another one in Ashrafiyeh. I don't see a public museum accessible to everyone. That doesn't mean that we don't have public multicultural spaces such as popular ones such as Burj Hamoud or maybe Mar Mikhail or anything. But as someone who's expert, if someone is an architect came to you and said, listen, I am asked by the, hopefully, public authority to move from this multi-communitarism to multiculturalism, what guidelines could you give them so that they could take in their profession your advices in consideration?
Thank you for the question. I think that is a very relevant one because in many cases you can speak for a long time about the let's say how good these spaces are and so on, but they are not always easy to be implemented. And I would say that in most of the cases, at least I would say in all the cases that I know, there is a need for a very strong political will and a municipality that is really looking after that kind of idea. The most well-known case is, in recent history, is the one of Barcelona with a municipality with the advice of Oriol Bohigas, who was really thinking about a civic city that was relying on the production of public buildings and public spaces. But that was a huge investment and a super strong political, let's say, drive that was derived from let's say, the post-Franco dictatorship environment. So only because of that it was possible in that time, but the reality is that this same kind of idea has been, I wouldn't say exported, but tried in different ways in other cities, especially in Latin America. In the case of Colombia, Medellin made a great effort with Santiago Fajardo, that was also a very kind of charismatic politician that has been there for many years, and that he promoted the idea that if people had better public spaces, they are going to have a better image of themselves, so they are going to, in a way, take more care about their own city. And actually was working quite well, and statistics also were showing how the crime rate in Medellin dramatically fell from the 90s to what is today, and actually today is even a very touristic city, and it was done through this, as I'm saying, mayor that was really fostering this idea. In the case of San Salvador, it's the same as Nayib Bukele, that now is the president of the República of Salvador, who had this idea of generating this publicness and these new spaces for the city. So he was promoting that with a lot of energy. But I understand that it's not, unless you have this very, very strong political will, it's not very easy to implement these kind of plans, and you will have always people opposing them, saying, well, we don't have the culture here for this kind of a space, people is not going to respect it, it's not going to work. There is always this kind of debate with these kind of spaces, but the only way to start with these kind of ideas is by proving them. So I think that the only thing that I can advise as an architect is to start with one and then see how it goes. And normally, something that I'm not mentioning, time is important. Sometimes it's not necessary to build the entire compound. And I think that this is also very relevant. Real estate development, they lose a lot of money if they are not built into a certain amount of time. So they want to be quick, and they want to have the building as a whole as soon as possible, and the landscaping and everything ready for 2 years, 1 year and a half, whatever. But with this kind of more public operations, you can do a step by step. You first liberate a ground, you generate a fountain where people can come, then you generate something else, you propose a program that is backing up that space. So you are building step by step a sense of that public space that people is getting used to it with the pass of the time, and you are not imposing something that is like a UFO, coming to the city and say, okay, this is the new public space, but you are stepping down that and then facing it to a way in which people can naturally appropriate, and then the planning of it can also be reflective of that progressive appropriation of the people of the space. So this is the only advice that I can have, is try with one and not doing it at once, but staging it in order to allow people to know that space, appropriate, make changes accordingly, and so on and so forth.
We have time for 2 more questions. Okay, at the back.
Thank you for the lecture. I'm actually kind of interested about the high-rise example that you were giving. High-rises actually play an important part in the urban fabric of a city. And since we're talking about culture, I'm just wondering how high-rises could actually contribute to the cultural identity of a certain place.
Yeah. To tell you the truth, it's a good question because it's a very difficult one. In general terms, when you think about the high-rise, it's almost like the opposite to what I was saying with this last example. The high-rise is one building that has a very small impact in the ground floor. That is normally the floor in which everyone comes together. The ground floor is that the one that, in a way, is more able to engage with the social fabric. The more you go up, the more difficult it becomes for the people to gather. So you have the case of, I don't know if you know the walkie-talkie in London by Rafael Vignoli, that the municipality said, okay, you can build this thing, but you need to provide a public space to compensate the space that you're taking from the city. So we decide to put that public space on the top of the building. So to get to that space, you have to go through a security control, then they look at your backpack, you have to show your passport, and you can go up, and what you have over there is a cafeteria, actually, that looks like a normal restaurant. It is a public space, but actually it is much more related to a private kind of development. So this kind of experience is really disconnecting the social fabric of the city from the building. And I think that high-rise is always this challenge, that is very difficult to manage in that sense. So I don't think that what we were doing in that building was, in a way, solving the problem, but maybe trying to ameliorate some of the consequences. Like if you have read this novel by Ballard, The High Rise, it's quite dystopian, how the life in a building that is a high rise can be a total nightmare. There is a moment in which the neighbors start to talk to each other from the balcony, and I found always this moment the only moment of a kind of, in a way, spontaneous interrelation between people. And this is the only thing that we were trying to develop. Okay, we can't develop an interrelationship between the city and the building because it's hard, because the impact or the friction between the building and the ground floor is minimum, and it's very difficult to do that. We can try, we are allocating program in the ground floor, we have sky slopes, we have things like that, but we are aware of the difficulties of that, and we are putting much more effort in this interrelation between neighbors and programs that are linking these interrelations and so on. But as I'm saying, it's not really solving the problem, only probably ameliorating the consequences of that problem. I'm sorry that I don't have a better answer, but I will work on it.
One last question.
It's a question about form, and about what you were saying a bit at the beginning, questions of transculturation, hybrid situations. So you working in other countries of other cultures, from Spain to Salvador, seeing this project or the one in, I think it was Nigeria, or which country you had the power? I don't remember exactly, the Nairobi. So I'm wondering if a way of avoiding or not entering the problematics of historical similarities or historical eclecticism or mimetism of forms that correspond to existing culture, as you've shown before with the copying of the mosaics or things by the modernists like OMRAN, is the way of avoiding these problems dematerializing form in a way that we go back, like I'm seeing there, to questions of structures and function instead of approaching real forms in architecture that sometimes relate to maybe historical typologies or well, questions of identity in terms of architecture. When I see here, well, series of walls that try to address a situation but not be a legible form that would go back to a particular history. I don't know if my question is clear. You understand what I'm saying?
No. This is something that I've been thinking about actually, because in a way, when you're using form in the way that we describe it, it's inevitable to think that you are relating back to typology. In a sense, typology that is not driven by function, I think, but is related to this idea of form as a system of relations. No? Like a courtyard house establishes certain relationships between the people who is inhabiting the house, which is very different from the relationships that may occur in a modernist or conventional, let's say, apartment block. No, that you have a corridor, no, and that kind of relationship, the one of the corridor, is very, very different from the one of the courtyard. And of course, when you are working with form, and form that is in a way reduced to this kind of organization of relationships, you are probably going to references in the history of architecture. But what I'm saying are references that are not so much related to symbolic representation, but more related to forms of ways of living. No, and there is always a decision. It's almost impossible to eliminate form. Many people tried before. I don't think that is successful. It's better to acknowledge the form that you're working with, and by doing that, you're also able to give people a reference from which to relate. So if you are working with a courtyard house, the people, they acknowledge that they are in a courtyard house and they are able to live accordingly in the way that they want, but in confrontation or in relation to that set of, or this organization that you have provided. If you try to dissolve it and you try to do this kind of dream of the open plan, probably what you're doing is dissolving also the possibility for people to really position themselves towards the architecture that is being proposed. And I think that if you remove that clarity in the formal organization of architecture, you are also removing certain of the capacity of the people to appropriate and to inhabit that typology. And as I'm saying, typology is a courtyard, but a courtyard can become, I wouldn't say a hospital, but it could be, actually I live in a courtyard house that is the result of a church. It was, the church itself is a courtyard now, and they're surrounding, and of course it implies a way of living, of course. I mean, you have all the neighbors looking at you every morning. No, I mean, it's not the same than the flat. You have your corridor, you don't care, you don't see anyone. And I think that what is important is that we are aware of the forms we are working with. We are aware of the conditions that we want to articulate, how we want to separate different kind of conditions within a kind of inhabitation structure. And of course, it implies structure, it implies construction, it implies other things, but I think that if these things are clear for the people, in a way that they are clear in the way that they are presented as a spatial organization, they have more possibility for them to be modified, transformed, and than the totally open plan that in most of the cases is quite misleading. And this is the experience of how these super gigantic open halls have worked in the history of architecture. And I would say, just to finish with that, that in many cases, a square is working well as a square in a city because it has certain limits. They can be diffused, they cannot be diffused, they can be of many ways, but there is a certain intensity in the way that the courtyard is inhabited because of the limits of the courtyard or the square. If you have a gigantic, vast area that can be, oh, you can do whatever you want, probably people will be too scared. No, and I think that this mastery of the scale of the relationships is probably the most important thing to address when trying to work in the way that we try to work.
Thank you so much, Francisco. So next, from the Lil Madina initiative in Saida, we will have Lyne Jabri representing her work. So to introduce Lyne, Lyne is an urbanist and an architect. In 2013, she and a few others founded the Lil Madina initiative, which is a professional research and activist platform advocating for more socially sensitive and environmental planning practices in the city of Saida. She holds a master's degree in urbanism and strategic planning from KU Leuven, and she did her thesis on water systems and urbanism in the city itself, and now she's starting her PhD around the same topic. Today she's going to tell us a little bit more about Lil Madina's work and what they've done in Saida, and present an alternative reading of the city through its water systems. So please help me welcome Lyne.
Okay. Good evening. So I will be presenting our work in Lil Madina in the city of Saida. So this is Saida. It's a coastal city, and the mountain retrieves from the seashore by a certain width, leaving behind a certain stretch of coastal plain. With the mountain, the morphology of the mountain is that of a 7 overlooking hills. The negative space of it is the pathway of water. In the past, water was very present in the life of people in the city and the surrounding. So water, people used to go to rivers and springs to bathe, to do their laundry, to fetch drinking water, and as well as certain social systems and infrastructures to distribute this water by gravity, especially for irrigation purposes, developed over time. Sorry. Amongst all this landscape of water, perhaps the most sophisticated system is the one found to the north of the city. It relies on one main canal that is commonly called the Khaskiye Canal. The canal catches water with a small dam some 4.5 kilometers upstream of the Awali, and it diverts the water with one main topographic line with a small inclination, sometimes even carving through the hills, and distributing the water on the coastal plain through openings in the canal and water pools and smaller canals. So through this system, the whole coast was irrigated, and Saida became famous for citrus and locate trees. So, sorry. I think في شيء غلط. Anyway. Maybe it's better that I...
Touching the screen.
maybe, yeah.
Yeah, it's a touch screen. So.
Okay. Yes. Okay. So if we zoom in on this map, we start understanding that that this irrigation system, all this water system, was the backbone for everything else in this area. So it was the backbone of where the pathways were, the roads, where how the city was developing, how the plots were being subdivided, because everyone wanted to reach water, the canals, and the backbone even for the start of the sprawl. So this is the map of in the 50s, in 1956. And perhaps the most interesting one of these infrastructures that have different layers is the one. It's this one. It's called the Sultaniye Street, and it contains the main canal, the Khaskiye Canal, underneath it. Sorry. It was the historical, so a retaining wall was built since ancient time to create a road on top of the canal. And this road was the main road that went to northern Palestine. And it contains a series of khans, or the hotels for merchants. And here the canal as well gains different layers of meaning, because it's a geological and a geographical border. You can see that it's the border between the mountain and the coast, between the irrigated coast and the not irrigated mountain. So all this logic of water that used to guide how the area was developing was systematically destroyed with the advent of modernity by a series of infrastructures and these infrastructures had a logic that was completely different than the logic of water. These infrastructures, while water is the logic of water is that of gravity, so it's the water wants to move towards the west, towards the sea. The logic of these new infrastructures, of modern infrastructures, are logic of the automobile or the car, and they are north-south because they're trying to link cities of the coast together. So, and since they were not very sensitive to the logic of water, we ended up with a broken water system, ancient water system. And as well, with modernity, water was not perceived anymore as a blessing, but so rivers were buried in culverts within the coast, within concrete culverts, and were turned into major sewer lines, where the sewage was. And as well, further upstream in 2006, sewage lines were constructed in the middle of the rivers, and with the first winter they were broken, so turning the whole rivers into open sewers, basically. It's true that today water has somehow disappeared from the perception of people in the city. And this is where, and from this reading and understanding of the city, we started as Lil Madina initiative in 2013 to try to push urban projects that are imposed on Saida or come to Saida, and the way the city is developing, to take more into consideration the logic of the landscape and the logic of water. So when we heard that the municipality was going to launch a reparcelization project in the orchards of East Wastani, we were afraid that it will be yet another blow to the water and ecological systems, like it was the case in the reparcelization project of the 1980s. So we tried to advocate for plans or for a planning that takes more into consideration the logic of water. We didn't oppose the project. We thought it was a lost battle to completely confront the project. So we said maybe try to push for a better planning that takes into consideration water, that works more in an east-west logic in order to let the water pass, that places the 25% public domain that results from the process of reparcellization to protect certain aspects of the water system, and what is historic and what is important elements from the site. So Habib is here. This is his plan. This is the plan of Habib. No, it changed. It changed. It's the old one. Mustafa Fawad. Yeah. Yeah. So, what the reparcellization project that is being planned, yeah, it's yours. Sorry. So the reparcellization project is being planned simultaneously with a project for widening of the Sultaniya Road that carries the main water canal of Khaskiye. And we are afraid that to avoid what happens usually with reparcellization in Lebanon is that to avoid expropriation, they use the opportunity of reparcellization to gain square meters of public domain to widen certain roads, which is, we are afraid what's going to happen with the Sultaniya Road. This is the Sultaniya Road with the canal, and it is there on the... So what we are trying to advocate for is that this is the current condition of the road. And this is what we are afraid is going to happen. And we're trying to say, okay, maybe it's a good idea to use the excuse of the 25% public domain that results from reparcellization, but let's use it to protect this edge and create public park and public sidewalks around, along the Khaskiye Canal. And the idea of using public space to protect, and it's something that we have been using a lot in our work in Saida. For example, when we're working along the rivers, we're trying to promote these rivers as to clean these rivers and remove the sewage from the middle of the rivers and create public parks. So this is how we advocate for it, parks along the rivers. Which brings me to my conclusion, to the end of this presentation, and to tie it with the idea of this panel about the topic of this panel of public space. And the reflection, this is a reflection upon our work. It seems that public space is a common thread in all our work. In fact, often we find activists in Lebanon fervently advocating and defending public and green space. This is, and we dream of public space in its most democratic sense, of course. But we tend to forget the reality that public space that is being planned is often ends up being privatized or given up for other public institutions. For example, in the old reparcellization project that happened in Saida, all the green spaces were built up were given up for public institutions. The only remaining one is that one, the triangle over there, and the two roundabouts on the road. All the rest is gone. The what? Ah, the other one. This is Mustafa Fawaz, the old reparcellized. Yeah. Yeah. Ah, yes.
Time for public engagement later.
We tend, and then there's whatever is existing as public spaces that are working public spaces, we often find them being privatized and gated. This is one example that happened in Saida. We lost, So to end, when we ponder upon this reality, it becomes clear that in a country that is ravaged by clientelism and corruption, there is a paradox in advocating for public space and expecting from a corrupt state to protect or maintain public spaces, because it is often the case that these spaces are privatized under the auspice of public officials. So public officials are blessing people who are privatizing these spaces. So what we are at now in Madina is try to not anymore look towards the state for protection of public spaces, but we are starting to lean towards communities and thinking about looking towards communities to see what are the possibilities of them creating public spaces and protecting these public spaces. But when we start thinking, looking into that direction, very often we find that, for example, this river edge where we're working on, which is upstream of one of the rivers, it's new communities. It's communities that don't really exist. People who don't know each other, who are coming from different places. So in this case, it's about rebuilding or constructing a community around this space before anyway thinking about it as a public space, and then wait for these people to start appropriating the space and lessen to the minimal what the municipality has a mandate over, if I'm clear. I don't know if I'm clear. So the municipality in that sense doesn't have a responsibility anymore, but it's the community living around the space that is responsible. And this means that maybe we should, in some cases, forget about the democratic kind of space, but think more of a space that is more appropriated by different people with a very little passageway along the river, for example, for the more democratic space. And the rest we let people plant it and appropriate it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Next, we will have a presentation by Sera Saad, who will be showing us her master's thesis project at Alba around a 7-kilometer pedestrian pathway through Ashrafiyeh.
لا لا ما هي لحظة بس بسلم أسلم الكلمات اوكي كانوا فاتحين كلهم مع بعض اي واحدة هذا يصير ما بتكسر علي
minimize. All right.
window دي
Can you check? Can you hear me? Yes. Hi, everyone. So this project started with a very basic question that I asked myself. And it was, can we still wander around Beirut in a city dominated by cars And with real estate pressure competing for remnant spaces in the city, can we still find non-constructed spaces in the city that we can use as public spaces, of course? This incited some curiosity to explore the area, followed by some Sunday morning walks with friends and family who have had different relationships with our city, some who grew up in it, others who just went there for work or for fun, usually by car and during heavy traffic. These tours revealed a staggering amount of dormant opportunities and of missed occasions in the city. So the result is an urban design proposal based on observations of local people practice of open public spaces in Beirut, with a focus on one peculiar neighborhood that is Ashrafiyeh. So this is a topographic map of the city of Beirut. So Beirut's natural urbanization grew along two hills, which occupied its eastern and western sides. So to the western side was the hill of Ras Beirut, and to the eastern side was the hill of Ashrafiyeh. And topography has widely influenced the urbanization on these hills, especially throughout the organic and vernacular growth of the city. Ashrafiyeh's peak, Ashrafiyeh is the one in magenta. Its peak is called the Sassine Square. The square today is used as a traffic-through intersection for commuters who come from outside of Beirut to get inside the city. So this is a map of Ashrafiyeh. Ashrafiyeh is one of the oldest residential districts in Beirut. Over the years, this geographic landform that is a hill that I just showed you in the topographic map has developed in many directions, and today it's very much dense, congested, and fragmented. So the traditional urban fabric of Ashrafiyeh was cut through by large infrastructural roads, which we can see in these diagrams. For example, the Shah Malik Avenue that cut through Tabaris. You can see the blocks from the old maps to the new maps being cut through. This made the pedestrian have such a hard time in the city because it gave cars a priority over pedestrians and over the human experience. So what I did is I decided to take a walk around the city. And in order to better understand the human experience in the city, I decided to experiment with different walking scenarios. This is a map of the different walking scenarios that I took. What's particular about these experimental scenarios was that I used local networks only to cross from one side of the hill to the other side. And what I would do is, okay, so every time I went, I would stand on one side of the hill, let's say at the Jesuit garden on the northern part of the hill, and try to walk to the Sufi garden, which is on the southern part of the hill, without using large roads, by using only local roads and just crossing the large roads. So I discovered one path that I have decided to develop for this project. The path is a 7-kilometer walk. It's a 1 hour, 45-minute walk around the neighborhood of Ashrafiyeh. This is a mapping of it. It crosses Turso into Talat Lakewe, then to a Room neighborhood. So it's a loop around the area. And this is the average slope, which is 4%. It's a section of the slope. Okay, so I'm going to show you just a bit of my discoveries as I walked. Okay. Okay, so these are all parts from the walk. So why this path in specific? for 6 different reasons. The first reason, it's an interface between the highest platform of the hill, which is the Sistine Square, and the lowest platforms, which are the harbor, which are the river, etc. 2, it has a specific topography. So because it's on an intermediate level, the slopes become very steep below it and above it. So most of the stairs are connected to this intermediate level, so you can go downhill or uphill through them. And because it was more slopey, it's been less urbanized along the years, so there are still opportunities of green spaces here and there around it. 3, it's an easy walk compared to the rest of Ashrafiyya, which is very hilly. The platform is more or less flat. As I said, it's a 4%, there's an average of a 4% slope. Number 4, it contains different landmarks, which not only make it more interesting to walk around and look at, but also it helps you navigate and find yourself on the hill. 5, it uses local networks only, as I said. And 6, it crosses most of the neighborhoods, so you can discover Ashrafiyya without the need to actually go uphill. This is a linear section of it, so it's 7 kilometers, 1 hour, 45 minutes. Okay, so in order to understand the relationship between open space and human beings in the city, I did a lot of mental maps, one of which is this one, which is a map that studies the sensorial relationships between the human being walking on this path and the open spaces available around it. And what this map shows is, as I was walking, non-visible open space, avoid the impact on the street, but no visual connection between what's happening inside and outside the barrier, filtered view into an open space, visible form street, an open space that's visible from a street travel or a public space, as well as mapping out the physical barriers like walls, fences, overflowing trees from private gardens, etc. So this morphological analysis unraveled a diversity of existing typologies between built form and open space that included areas where all domestic openings and different semi-open public spaces like courtyards, windows, stair landings were directed towards the street. You can see that in this section and in the pictures, which created a sense of, which created eyes on the street and gave streets a more intimate ambience, and the streets actually felt more safe. In other areas, streets were bordered by fences, like in Surso. They were bordered by fences of private open spaces, creating a very clear demarcation between private and public life. Other discoveries included the Tobaji Garden. They included a lot of abandoned open spaces in the city, like the Tobaji Garden, which is it's an orchard expropriated from the Fuad Boutros Highway project. The other would be, another one would be the abandoned railway in Badawi, as well as different types of residual spaces that bordered the public right-of-way or non-constructible parcels that could be an opportunity for small pocket parks or any type of temporary activation of the public space. Okay. Missing a slide. Placemaking as a tool to regenerate lost spaces. So, encouraging the integration of public spaces as the core of community life is a crucial tool in urban renewal. My proposal places the human experience in the public space as a top priority, which includes the local residents' cultural, social, functional, and comfort needs. Therefore, on a larger scale, a master plan, using the key principles of placemaking, so sociability, uses and activities, access and linkages, comfort and image, in order to provide attractive and safe public spaces that bring communities together. The master plan proposes a program that complements the functions already existing in the city. It proposes access and links to the rest of the city and to public transport around it. It proposes designated park and ride facilities to liberate the streets from unauthorized parking. And the conception of pedestrian-friendly streets, of course, with traffic calming measures, as well as proposals on how to make the existing open spaces more accessible for people. Okay, so moving through scales, I moved to a smaller scale in order to be able to explore the possibility of and the impacts actually of this project on the areas included in the walk. One of which is the Room neighborhood, which is the neighborhood facing the St. George Hospital, specifically Al Khazinain Street, which is an area that's now ghosted by the distress of eviction and abandonment of built and open spaces. Okay, so the proposed strategy builds on different opportunities to intervene in the neighborhood through better management of density, as well as the animation and activation of streets through a diverse program in the form of permanent and temporary interfaces. So I actually have proposed at different scales what we can do at different scales, at the scale of the building, the block, the street, and the neighborhood. These are some of the examples of how the program can work, and it's a mediation between temporary interventions that can activate the space and more permanent interventions. Also, another. Okay. So at the scale of the city block in a Room neighborhood, I tried to look for different cases of abandoned open space that can serve as opportunities. And so I found 5 different cases. One, A, it's expropriated land, which is the area over here, A, which is the orchard, the Tobaji garden, as well as the different houses around it that have been expropriated for the cause of the project that has now been stopped. And I've proposed turning it into a community garden because of its scale and the microclimate that allows us to actually grow food in it. The second would be B, which are plots owned by the municipality, which is something that's very recurrent in the city. And today they're used as parkings. So I'm turning them, and I would propose turning them definitely into open spaces because of the scarcity of open spaces that we have in the city. C, on privately owned plots. D, on small empty parcels, which are the non-constructible parcels, which are parcels like under 100 meters squared. And a lot of them were actually bordering the streets like these two. And E, the public right-of-way. This is the different locations of the project on the elevation of the street. Okay. And some simulations on how the design could work, how the different public spaces can be connected to each other through a network of public spaces. Okay. So the result or the objective of this would be to consolidate and requalify all of these spaces, as well as inserting them in a network of public spaces and connecting them to the rest of the neighborhood and the walk, of course. These are some of the objectives or the design guidelines for the street that we're working on. The whole path should be a well-connected street, a legible and safe street, pedestrian-focused street, and it has to serve as an active edge. Some simulations also on how the design for these areas could be. This is a paved street with an extension of a small play area for kids. This is the community garden. And these are some of the visuals of how people and cars can live together on one street. Okay, so I think for me the importance of this project is to show the value of the implementation of local solutions and small-scale solutions in the pursuit of the best version of our city of the future. These solutions through urban design are flexible because they provide opportunities for us to intervene on different scales and on existing streets. So by retrofitting existing streetscapes and buildings and existing open spaces, we can help equip cities develop resilience against present and future challenges, as well as taking advantage of every little bit of open space that can serve our everyday public life. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for your presentation and your extremely exhaustive project. يعطيك العافية. Our last exhibitor presenting today, before we take a 10-minute break and then we come back for the roundtables, is Edouard Souhaid. He will be presenting his master's thesis project at the École Spéciale d'Architecture in Paris, and it is called Play Architecture. So please give me a hand in welcoming Edouard. Control L.
Okay, so I'm not going to be too long, so you don't have to fall asleep. I'm going to try and keep up the rhythm. So, yeah, I'm going to present a project I did as a master's. It's really kind of a research project, and in a way, today I'm going to prove to you that when we talk about play, it can be a serious matter. So to fully comprehend the complexity and ambiguity that lies behind the notion of play, I started questioning the relationship of play with and of architecture. I divided my research on both the theoretical and anthropological aspect of play. The play of forms that generates rhythm, the free play of light, the wall and in-betweenness, and the concept of in-betweenness of architect Alba van Eyck. The play with circulation, La Promenade of Le Corbusier and La Dérive of Les Situationnistes. The play with the landscape, the notion of the genius loci portrayed by Tadao Ando, are all part of a theory that reveal a certain aspect of the word play. The anthropological aspect of play investigates playful schemes and fun programs by adding the notion of Theatrum Mundi by Richard Sennett in his book The Fall of the Public Man, games and sport with Roger Caillois, with his research on games and men, and religious rituals as important facets of social play. The functions of play and games in society have led to the development of culture and the organization of relationship between humans. In addition, play also contributes to the development of the schism in children by using transitional objects with Donald Winnicott theories, and reveals a new rapport to the world, an intermediate area that is the heart of my research. As a matter of fact, it is with the great diversity of play, of games that children develop and evolve physically, psychologically and emotionally. There are consequent studies on play, its function, and its theorization. But we notice that play can be divided and attributed a definition depending on the field of study. But the extent of it is so on one hand, play is attributed to behavior. The child plays with others to learn cooperation, express aggression, and tolerate frustration. On the other hand, play is a form of cognitive activity. We examine how the child forms and apprehends symbols that evolved and get more complex in adult life. The question of play in architecture is fundamental because it offers a new vision of our relationship with the world through some notion neglected by modernity like technicity, physical sciences, and mathematics. With the help of play, I introduce a universal that is non-representative of a historical association, but enables us to rethink and communicate with the world. The complexity of play triggered many questions, not only concerning the relationship between play and architecture, but also how play intervenes with architectural elements. I am often told, and I'm sure other students are, to play more with the plans, openings, ceiling heights, light, shadow, circulation, landscape. But what do they really mean by play? In an academic and professional context, architects use play constantly to associate it with architectural elements. When I was asked to play more with forms from architects and tutors, it was implied that I couldn't play hazardly. Playing is doing, and doing correctly, but it follows implicit rules difficult to define explicitly. Architects and artists talk and write about the play with forms. that we usually confuse with numerical proportions like a golden number or simple and pure symmetry. Play with form is a concept that should be explicitly studied and revealed through drawings. How do these things that are separated by space play together? How can we create order between space? The concept of play questions the conception of the architectural project and the process of the project. How can we draw this mysterious communication between several elements that can make us explain what Le Corbusier once said and once wrote: this is a correct, ingenious, and magnificent play of forms. The first theoretical aspect of my research was to understand the play of architectural forms as rhythm. Rhythm that French philosopher Henri Maldinet offered a convincing concept. We should not confuse rhythm of Maldinet with its classical definition of repetitive beat or tempo. It is not a repetition of oneself, but a perpetual renewal beginning by a fracture. We can compare Maldinet's concept of rhythm to the waves, not the tempo, which is a repetitive. And the waves is also repetitive, but also always changes from one and the other. The rhythm of forms for Maldinet is simply what passes through each form or each element to aspire with all others, creating an effect of a whole entity. An ensemble. For example, in Kazimierz Malevich painting with suprematism, elements, abstracts, forms, geometries are not numerically proportioned. There is no symmetry, although they do communicate and aspire to form a whole. The interest behind Maldinet's rhythm doesn't imply symmetry, nor fixed proportions. It is a just and unique creation. In other words, it implies an artistic aspect. This artistic aspect, this artistic side of architecture, its relationship with aesthetic theories, was clearly distinguished by Etienne Louis Boulet in the 18th century, separating from the more scientific aspect. If rhythm is every time unique and singular, so there is no recipe or precept, you have to try, to test, to question. Play with drawings, axes until we feel that the link between the whole is correct. Rhythm expresses and manifests itself broadly when drawing plans. I wanted to take time to reveal the notion of play through a series of hand drawing, constructing a concept and an idea using hand drawings. From a formal point of view, I started working on disequilibrium, on the autonomy of the line, on irregularities, dislocations, displacements, and opposite, while keeping in distance the two extreme poles where rhythm is deployed. On one hand, dead and static space, and on the other hand, inhabitable chaos. Rhythm is the right dynamic. All of these notions naturally are embedded and separated from function. I don't really like the word function, I use more usage. And that's when I felt the danger of formalism, the question of postmodernism, form for the sake of the form. But the challenge of my research was to verify that a proper work on play with forms, a rhythm of forms, not only contradicts necessarily the program or the usage, but it can amplify and serve it. It wasn't impossible for me that the play of form can serve social play. It is the capacity of rhythm to surpass and unite oppositions that brought me back to the Lebanese society. The territorial intervention where I chose to implement this method emerged with its own set of rules and questioning, which is essential to the comprehension of social play in this Lebanese society. It is crucial to be attentive to the specificity of the Lebanese society by conducting research centered on social spaces and the entertainment aspect of social anthropological play. Where do Lebanese play and interact? In the Lebanese society, social play is compromised. That is why I research ways and strategies to reevaluate it. I challenge the idea that a project that explicitly play with forms and where play is inscribed programmatically on two aspects. Firstly, by adding fun program and devices, and more importantly, secondly, by making programs play with each other, and by porosity and contamination can launch social play. There is a beneficial contamination between devices. The question of public space added another layer to our understanding of social play. I chose Beirut as a city which itself lacks well-thought and socially inclusive public spaces as a territory to study. Squares, more specifically, are the spaces where differences play and evolve into a co-presence and a coexistence which become unique to a territory. Nevertheless, public space lacks a certain attractivity. It is not enough to create a void where the public can interact. Architects need to provide hospitality to a space. That is why a proper play with form that generates rhythm and the play with program can aid appropriation. This place, this public space that I wanted to be a place where Lebanese would read their identity beyond their communal and confessional associations. On a more social aspect, it wasn't about erasing divisions by creating a secular citizenship, but rather to make them play together. On one hand, by incorporating traditional and divided programs like weddings, religious events, processions, and on another hand, to make sure that theater, sports, games, and art will contaminate the later. The hill of Deir el-Ala in Beit Mireh retraces the ancient history and communal divisions, religious and contemporary aspect of Beirut as a city. It is an example of the territorial influence that Beirut imposed on the mountains and coast that surrounds it. While keeping the universal approach of play, I started questioning the construct of the Lebanese identity from an anthropological aspect. The project in Deir el-Ala is intended to play with the notion of a society in a unique setting. The players can appropriate the space and social play is revealed.
Thank you so much, Edward. We're going to take a 10-minute break so we can get refreshments and some snacks in the lobby, and then we'll come back further on. So the theme of the general panel today for the past presentations that we've seen is domesticity in public space. And as you see, all of the presenters and panelists that are with us here who presented their work, all of them had crafted this very fine line between what it means to engage the public inside of a city and how that public itself manifests the spaces that it needs and reforms space in different types of cities and urban areas. So to start at least this conversation, what I'd really like to sort of pose as a first question is, how can we think of more ways in which we engage the public through design and development? Because in general, as architects, we receive a brief, right? We have a document that is provided to us by a formal entity that tells us this is what is required, these are the square meters that we want, and this is the program, do something with it. But then when it actually comes for us to engage the community within which we're going to be constructing our buildings, there's sort of a missed opportunity there, in my opinion. So I'd just like to open the panel with this general question for everyone who's sitting here who would like to sort of start with an answer for that. I know that, for example, Jessica and Habib have done extensive work in participatory projects. So maybe you guys could lead off with something.
Thank you, Ali. So my name is Jessica, and I'm representing Nahnu today, a research and advocacy platform for participatory policy making. We work for social inclusivity, and among other things, we chose to promote public spaces. Before I describe more our work, I'd like to quickly understand who from the audience is not from architecture or urban studies. Okay, you're filming. What's your background, educational background? Okay, other fields that are farther from demography, urban studies, geography. Do we have people who are not from this overall sphere of spatial planning, etc.? No? Okay. So I'm not from any of these studies. I studied first computer engineering, then machine learning, and was applying this in academic settings to the understanding of brain and cognitive psychology. What brings me here today is that I decided at some point in my life that I wanted to work for social change. But I didn't want to work on it using the traditional political methods. I wanted, in Lebanon, this is a very inefficient way, in my opinion, to drive social change. I wanted something very concrete, something that we can apply science to in order to really understand what are the root causes of our problems. And the campaign to reopen Hirsch Beirut for All provided an extremely rich case study. For those who don't know Hirsch Beirut, it's the largest park in Beirut. In our opinion, it's the only park in Beirut. And it had been closed for around 20 years, and for a long time, no one reclaimed it. You would think that opening the gate, opening the park, is a very modest ambition, but however, opening this park looked more like opening Pandora's box. And I will start, before really answering your question, to give an idea about why I'm saying this and why public spaces offers a very rich reflection of our deepest problems as a society. And I believe that architecture and urban planning is a main planning methodology that can change social processes or drive change in them. Through our campaigning, we discovered many thinking habits of people in Lebanon. That, for example, dichotomies between civilized and uncivilized people. So civilized people are people who, I'm relaying common thinking we received from the public, or even from municipalities. Lebanese people cannot deal with public spaces. They are not educated enough to be in public spaces. We've heard many things about littering, about not behaving properly, and this is why the municipality in many places prefers to close a garden, even a very small garden, and Hirsch Beirut, for example. And many times when we investigate this, actually, we discover that there are design issues or there are governance issues. For example, once I was in a debate with a municipal staff in Beirut, and she was saying, look at how savage people are. Do you see this median in the road? It has bushes, etc. It has nice greening. People go and cross it and damage these plants. And when we looked into the problem, it turned out there are no pathways to cross the street. So there were no pathways for mobility. So yes, people crossed from whatever they were able, and this led to the damage of plants. Littering. In all countries, littering is solved by giving fines to people who violate regulations of a park. In Hirsch Beirut, there are no fines that are given, for example. And when we start exploring the behavior of people in public spaces and using public spaces differently, we reveal many underlying systems and different controls over public space that lead to this. I'll give a short example about this once. Can I? Very short. So once we put benches in a street in Tariq Jdide. At every how simple initiative it is, it made it to national news because the municipality of Beirut worried about this creating a major disequilibrium in Tariq Jdide. And for example, we had people say, please put a bench here because my neighbors are parking on the sidewalk. Others said, no, we don't want a bench there because people will start at night taking drugs here. Others, no, they will start littering, etc. So we started discovering all this hidden control things that are happening in public space. When we come to who is responsible for this, to govern this, we have a major responsibility on the municipality. However, the municipality is structurally unequipped to deal with and to administer public spaces because it does not have the proper staff and it cannot actually, in the current setting of Lebanon, control public spaces or implement policies related to this.
That's a very interesting point that you're touching upon. Like, what does it mean to control a public space, and how do these systems of control actually manifest themselves? And I kind of want to go back to something that Francisco had mentioned in his speech when he talked about transculturalism and how it manifests itself in the public realm. Do you see an immediate relationship between sort of cultures that have this mass, diverse representation of different groups, and at the same time, a mass increase in security measures to regulate public spaces? Because we look at cities like London and New York and Paris and all of these major urban centers that pride themselves on having large public spaces. But then at the same time, there's a gigantic system of security that is making sure that these spaces are functioning the way that a government wants them to function.
I think it's an interesting question because in a way, you're trying to imply that the more you liberate the public realm, the more control you need to have of it, which is not necessarily the case even in London. I'm not so familiar with New York, but in the case of London, there is also this thing that many of the so-called public spaces, they are not actually public. I think that is happening in many cities. They are fake, let's say, public spaces because they are privately owned. So they have, in a way, the right, let's say, to surveil what is private. And this was very famous during the Occupy movement in London, that they occupy Paternoster Square, that is very close to St. Paul's Cathedral. And they were evicted from there because it was actually a private space. And the city is full of these private spaces that are very well curated for consumerism, and they have all these branches, like in London, the more typical ones, Pret-a-Manger, Costa, we have specific ones. And everything is curated for that kind of environment, but they don't really represent public space in the sense that I understand it's a public space today. And in reality, I don't think that you need to have more control of that. I think that in most of the cases is based on certain fears for the confrontation to the public space in itself. I understand at the beginning it's scary to coexist with people that are performing in the city in very different ways from the ones that you normally perform. But I also really believe that you need to handle that. I mean, if you really want to have an experience that is close to what democracy might be, it is all about being able to live with people that live in a very different way from the one you're living. So, and I don't believe that is about control, but it's a kind of reciprocal awareness. The more people, the easier it's going to be to be aware of that diversity. And to the contrary, the more control, the more sense of suspicion is going to raise, and the less this unfolding of plurality is going to happen.
But, yes.
Okay. Actually, also the more people, the more control because of the eyes on the streets. It's kind of like what we talked about with when the activities bordering these open spaces provide like a lot of people being around, it creates a type of informal control for the spaces and people would vandalize them less. But when the spaces are not integrated in the urban fabric and they're bordered by fences, and like all of our gardens today, you'll definitely need security guards and more control, because there's no connection between people around you and whatever people are doing inside the space.
Just to explain a little bit why I mentioned control is because today public space is controlled by informal and hidden groups. And Hirsch Beirut is an example of this. Hirsch Beirut, it's at the center of neighborhoods of dominantly different sub-communities, and also it's a military zone controlled by different groups. On one side, you have the Sunni political groups controlling. On the other side, you have the Shia political groups controlling. You have Palestinian camps, and you have the military as well dispersed. And for example, a lot of people don't know that Hirsch Beirut currently is divided in two. And one of the excuses that the municipality tells us is that on one side we cannot control the behaviors of people, so this is why we fenced it.
Municipally, it's divided between...
There is a fence dividing the park of Hirsch Beirut in two.
Who controls either side?
For us, we are not convinced by what the municipality says, and they are evasive over saying what happens, but they imply that it's other nationalities that are not under the rule of law that control it.
This brings up another very interesting question that also relates to some of the things that the people on these panels have been saying. So this other person that we right now in Lebanese politics keep on referring to recurringly as either these people who are coming to destabilize our economy, or these people who are trying to spark a war with Israel, or these people who are trying to do all of these different things, because we somehow do not have a system by which we blame ourselves for the problems that we have. But then at the same time, we can take that and extrapolate it upon issues of transculturalism, right? Like if we are to claim that we're going to be this democratic, open, inclusive nation, we cannot actually achieve any of that so long as we keep introverting within ourselves and trying to solve these problems by blaming the other. And essentially, the concept of the other translates into everything in Lebanese politics, whether the economy, the access to public space, the access to services, and the other in many ways becomes other elements of Lebanese society because we have some form of transculturalism, which I don't like to refer to it as transculturalism because it's really the same culture, just different.
You mean multi-communitarism or?
Multi-communitarism, thank you, yeah. So we do have a sense of multi-communitarism, but the problem is it's sort of taken all of these extremes when it comes to enclaving. Beirut is a very enclaved city, and it is not the product of the civil war. It has been an enclaved city for the last 200 years, but the idea is how can we use public spaces to subvert this enclaving and try to propose more inclusive spaces in whichever of your opinions whoever would like to share.
Okay. In fact, it's much more complex. There is several layers. There's obviously an anthropological level. There is a control, political control, but political control in Lebanon is not similar to countries where you have a very strong state that is serving a certain class of people. There's the multi-communitarism in Lebanon. It's the only Arab republic or the Arab country where it's not a dictatorship.
That wajh Arabi,
No.
because we still have a problem with that as an identity.
But how wajh شو؟
That wajh Arabi, because as a country we still cannot overcome that
Yes.
portion of identity.
Yes.
That's yeah. It well, yeah.
So,
No, please, if you'd like to have anything, yeah.
so if I may.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. So I was very interested by what I learned from Mexico and this area of cultural hybridization. Well, this was a context where there's a Latin American melting pot, which is with different cultures, Indian, African, Spanish, very, very different. And this hybridization through time, through 500 years happened. While in what we see in Lebanon is that we widely share the same history, the same language, the same culture, but it's our imaginary that is dividing us. There's a very common word in Arabic, which is in all the villages of Lebanon, they were not only sharing the same space or public space, but also sharing, there's a lot of villages where people were Maronite and moved to Shia, and from Shia moved to Maronite, and Sunnis moved to Shia. So all this is fabricated. It's a social construct, this question that culminates now with behavior. To read in the newspaper this week that, for example, the garbage coming from this Christian community cannot be, we did not accept it in our Costa Brava or the reverse. So there is a problem, and I don't think that the state is a problem. These are mainly mentalities. So if I can refer, for example, to specifically to the issue of Hajj Beirut, I don't really think that it is a position of the Sunni community. Yes, because in the municipal council you have several voices. Christians and Sunnis in the municipal council agree.
They do not represent the powers, the underground, as the field, the gatekeepers, the people who control informally.
Yes, but the people that control informally take their orders from the municipality.
The municipality takes orders from higher political. The you mean the municipal council?
No, what I want to say that it is not as simple as that. It's
of course not, but we are
yes, there is
in 2 minutes.
anthropological approach that is, for example, sociologist Nabil Bayhoum worked on mentalities and well, and my personal history also. I mean that in the Sunni communities and in the Greek Orthodox communities were urban, living in the cities of the coast. They are very conservative, and well, this is the mentality that the Hajj Beirut is a salon. Salon, I remember when I was a kid, children couldn't go to the salon. Salon is always closed. Only when there is important visitors or family or kaza, بيفتحوا salon. And it's always closed, and the naphthalene smell was always there. And this is shared by both Christian and Muslim families in Beirut. And for having, I really was very.
For me, it's not cultural.
No,
I'm not
but
making
there is
cultural.
this layer. It's not just mechanical that the political party talks directly to the gatekeeper and stop. Okay? No, I'm trying to show that there's other dimensions. It's so there is a kind of consensus. Let's say, let's take the concept of the state, if you want. The concept of the state in Lebanon, for example, that everybody has long agreed for a long time that the state should be weak. The laissez-faire of the state was erected into a political principle that characterized all the governments till the beginning of the war. And even now, for example, I worked a lot on the issue of, for example, heritage building, heritage in the city. So, well, everybody agrees in Lebanon to preserve the Lebanese house and these heritage buildings in the city. But when it comes to them, their house, they never agree. There is a consensus, a very wide consensus in the Lebanese society to be conservative with respect to the land property. The principle of law we inherited from the French during the mandate was that, okay, the land is yours, you own the land, but what you can do on your land is decided by the collectivity. And so the idea of preserving a house because there is a consensus of preserving them should not be a problem. But here it's a problem. Why? Because people mostly agree in Lebanon that private property is an absolute right. And now, while you are speaking, there is a new law that is today at the Council of Ministers to say that we have to compensate for the FAR on a piece of land. That means if there's a forest on your land and they have a FAR of, let's say, 1, and you bring it to 0.5, for example, to protect the forest, which is what should do any public planning institution. And now, because of this law, the owners will be compensated.
For reducing the FAR on their plot?
Yes.
From whom? Who provides the compensation?
State.
The bankrupt state?
This is why it's absurd now. But the law is this was proposed for the heritage buildings, the transfer of development rights. What means transfer of development rights? It means that I, as a state, I'm so weak, so I can't say that this beautiful palace or house has to be protected. Okay, this happens everywhere, all around the Mediterranean.
Absolutely, absolutely. I'd like to take a question from the audience at this point. So what I'd like to do is actually involve you guys while the discussion here is going on, so you also have a say. So would anybody like to add something or ask something? Yes?
I just want to ask a quick question, but you don't have to answer now, just to drive my point about Hersh Beirut. A rhetorical question.
We have to take the ladies.
Just a rhetorical question. Far from big infrastructure projects and big changes in laws, Hersh Beirut has 3 gates, or more even, on 3 of it, on all its edges. Why are these gates are not open? This is my question. So this is really political. And for me, it's not, the question is not social, cultural, it's about politics.
Thank you, Jessica. Yes, please. We can continue this later because it's 5 p.m. now and we have to wrap this up soon. So we'd like to take a few questions from the audience. I'm sorry. Yes, please.
I don't have a question. I have not a reply,
okay.
A statement that the problem of Hersh Beirut and all other public spaces, Hersh Beirut, it's major problem. The major problem is the political willingness, political will, and they are afraid of gathering all. It's in the middle of at the demarcation line تقريبا between the
بدر والضاحية and طريق جديد.
Can I speak in Arabic? No.
It's preferable that you don't.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So this is 1. 2, they completed it in 1997, but there is no management plan or operation plan. And this is the problem of all of the approach of public domain. The government doesn't have the approach of management and operation and maintenance. This is a main problem. And this is, I want to compare, I'm against the, people misuse. This is the approach of bourgeoisie mind, because they don't, when we talk about municipality, they look at people at lower class that they don't merit to have public space. Why? Let's look at the Corniche. The Corniche, it's a public space.
The only public space in the city.
Yes, and
arguably.
it works very well. It's very successful. What lack is the maintenance and to oblige to put laws, to not control it, no, to put laws and apply the laws. You cannot throw, you cannot litter, you cannot misuse. This is what we lack. We lack maintenance and management of public space. And there is a will, I want to tell you about, let's talk about public garden. Public garden are neglected intentionally, and they are used for drugs and for people, I don't know what. So this is a way to change the users of public spaces.
Yes,
This
and no.
is debatable.
This is
This
debatable, yes.
and need more
But
time to talk about.
I'd like you to pass the
Yes,
microphone, please, to
of
the
course.
gentleman,
Thank
because he
you.
seems to have had a comment.
No, I'm just wondering why we're comparing ourselves to London and New York when the
Nobody's comparing.
No, but you're talking about public spaces as if like we're a cold country where people need to be told where to go and be liberated and have fun. Like what was being said before, Lebanon, Beirut specifically, although like it has a proximity to an immense amount of public space, whether it's the mountains or the sea, whether it's our roads that are very, very free compared to the roads in London and in New York, of how you can behave, what you can say, where you can drink, one second, where you can walk, what you can do. So there's something, and you were saying something specifically about our unwillingness to actually say it's our mistake, and that creates schisms in our society. Brexit happened, right? With like one of the countries that is supposed to be on the forefront of what is understanding, sharing, acceptance, etc. So there are...
Brexit is the product of the rise of
happened,
general
people
right-wing
voted.
nationalism
Maybe it
across
wasn't
Europe.
implemented or not, but people voted, right? So in a sense, like, I just think that we have a lot of potential in what we have now, and not necessarily in opening gardens or having more gardens that are in Beirut or not. I'm not saying, it's just that there's a strategy that we can build on, that we can say, listen, we have a lot of freedoms here, we have a lot of freedoms there. Like, as you were saying, like maybe what we need is like bins and more kind of someone keeping things clean. And there's already a lot of safety. Like you don't walk on the streets of Beirut and feel you're not safe, as you would walk in London or in New York or in most of these places you're talking about. So for me, and I've been back for 3 years, okay? And when I lived in London, I didn't go to a park every day, far from it. And I'm sure no one here that lived in London goes to a park every day. They might go once a month. And even London, which is raining 300 days a month, you probably like barely touch the park.
But then what's your solution?
No, the solution is there. You're living. It's just about like how you relate to these things and how you understand them, and not in a comparative manner, but in like what is there, how am I actually living my life, and if you live your life somewhere else also, it's not just an impression of how these places are, because it's much more controlling than what you think. And as Francisco was saying, also there, and in New York also, because I was there and I took a course on that, also a lot of these public spaces are privately owned until further notice. So they put des bacs à fleurs to eliminate that space. You can go in and out, but it's fully private. Anyway.
Thank you. We're gonna take one last One last comment
Just
from
wanna,
Edouard.
yeah, unfortunately we don't have a lot of time, but you talk a lot about green spaces, park, but there is this very distinction to be made between what is a green space and a public space. Like, it's not because a park is not the public, it doesn't represent politics, and it's exactly what Francisco was telling about power and public space and politics and public space. And I do think that the public space that we have in Lebanon is a reflection of the state and how the state is managing its power over its people. If you look a bit of history, how does politics control people at the end of the day? It's about how they interact in the city and how they interact with each other, so they do control the public space. And we don't have a lot of time to go into the differentiated, but I just wanted to ask a question about urban planning, and something that we notice a lot and joins a bit what Jabri was saying, is that why is the state so stuck in the modernity era? Why is the state stuck in extending roads, extending more paved? Why is it so obsessed with the cars? And I do think that's one of our main issues, is that it's a question of perspectives. And why do we think that this project of the Sultaniya Road or others about extending roads is such an important issue, rather than saying, okay, we don't want cities to be overwhelmed by cars, we want pedestrian, and with pedestrian, you get more public space, you get more parks, you get more. So what you were saying, he was talking about roads, it's not true, because everybody is in his car, individualist, in a kind of individualist kind of way, only in his car, he throws the trash out of his car. So I just want to understand this from an urban point of view. I mean, why are we stuck in this modernity era? What's happening? And maybe Lynn can...
Just want to...
That is a... This question requires an entire discussion by itself, but... Yes. No, you will have the right, but we just... I'm here to be a time Nazi. We have 3 minutes and we need to wrap this up. So I'm just letting you all know. Please, Lyne.
No, but maybe it's as well adding, so you can answer to both. I want to go back to the idea that there is no...
The welfare state in Lebanon does not exist, I'm sorry. So that's not a state. What is a state? If it is not a welfare state, what is it? Okay. So if you go back, for example, to Max Weber description of powers, the different type of powers. So you have the traditional power, which is the case for most of the politicians in Lebanon, Jumlat, Christians, families, and etc. Then you have the charismatic power. Somebody comes, is new, and who speaks very well at the television, and it was the case of Kamal Jumlat, when he was leader of the left wing in Lebanon. It's also the case of Hassan Nasrallah, obviously. And the third type, which came later, is the rational power. And when you go to vote for people, and when you vote for people, you read their program, you listen to them, what they are saying, so you are voting for a program and not for a person. So, which is now the case in many of democracies in the world. But here we are still at the traditional power. People that are here are not really, there's nothing that is a homogeneous block that we can say this is a state. And we can't say that this homogeneous block that does not exist is stuck in modernity. We are mixing between an architectural concept that certainly is very far from what these people know about architecture and urban planning. They are not stuck. If you want to know why the Fuad Boutros highway that had to be executed, we stand in front of them. We resisted for 2 years, and finally the project was cancelled just because we have showed with Rami Saman, which is a transport mobility specialist, he convinced everybody that if they do this highway, it will bring more disorder than if it is not done. And they finally decided at the CDR that they dropped it. And now we are working, we are lobbying to make this area that is already expropriated, to make it a park in the city. And the municipality approved in the municipal council that this project, in fact, not a project, but this idea of transforming it into a park. So I think things are complex, and it's very difficult to just now in this very small discussion say everything, but this is what I just wanted to answer. Thank you.
How do you do? Like, I just want to know, because
I work in conflict 50% of the time, in conflict, because with one of Awaz, for example, and many other, we are fighting with these people. And
so it's always a conflict. It's you do feel
yes,
that
but sometimes the conflicts can like the issue of Harsh Beirut.
Okay.
Muhammad and Jessica were yes, Rabbit Baida, and so you can. I was very happy about this. I never thought it was possible. For example, if you want to just develop a little bit, we were all convinced that change could not come without a political change. So this is why Beirut Madina existed. We worked a lot to do this, and then in Beirut, Ula, in fact, there was we got 40% of the votes. With 10% more, if it happened, we would have changed the face of Beirut. Hirsch Beirut, the Liaison Douce project, Fouad Boutros, etc. So this is what happened in Barcelona when the socialists got the power after Franco. And the face of the city changed. So I think political power is very important. And I think in Lebanon, we have an opportunity. There is free elections, in fact, and this is very precious. It is not the case only Lebanon and Tunisia. And we are fighting for this. And I hope I will be still living when this will change.
Hopefully. Okay, one last comment, and then we have to wrap up.
A closing comment that goes back to what our urban planner said, and that I think is very valuable. I really appreciate all the presentations and the awareness that you have for public space, from claiming some kind of natural resource that can be upgraded to a community managed public space, to the idea of also appropriating whatever is existing and scaling it up and finding this kind of path ring something valuable, to the idea of play. I think that they demonstrate a large spectrum of different approaches to the problem of public space today that is very rich, and that probably today there are student work, but probably soon it's going to be also professional work, and we need to be really aware of it. But when talking about politics and how things are transformed in the city, we have to take into account that when these changes happened in Barcelona, but also in Seville, and new governments came, in many of the cases there were architects that were part of these municipalities, and they were part of the leading voices within the parties. And maybe it's not stupid to say that because you have this kind of awareness, it's a good opportunity to engage with the real politics of the cities in order to produce these changes in the same way that it has happened in the history of recent cities in Seville, in Barcelona, and so other places, because we're always talking about politics as something that is external to us, but we are part of it. And the more we are confident in being part of it, the more we have a power of transformation.
Okay, thank you all so much for being with us today, and all of our panelists for their incredible presentations and discussions. Thank you. We will see you tomorrow at 10 in the morning, hopefully.
And thank you, Ali.